Okay, guys, today I have something very different for you. I have a podcast on the story of malaria in colonial India. This is for my class, History and Invention of Tropical Diseases. I'm your host, Sean Hartnett, but I'm sure you already know that. Today we have Tropical Chronicles, podcast episode 1. We all know that diseases have heavily shaped the modern world, from the bubonic plague wiping out a large portion of the population and leading to the collapse of feudalism and the beginnings of capitalism in general, to malaria, history's most deadly illness. It is true that the humble mosquito has killed more people than any other organism, than any other animal. At one point, it was believed that roughly 20% of all people in the world, or even possibly more, have died of malaria. Well, more accurately, you could claim that since the average death rate from, say, the 1900s to now was like 1.5 million a year for a long time, you could make a case that it's killed. So 1.5 million for the past 2 decades. Now it's closer to 700,000, but that's 30 million easily in 20 years. Regress the data all the way back, and you can see that it clearly is among the deadliest. So the first part we should talk about is the life cycle of malaria. So malaria is a life-threatening illness which is caused by Plasmodium parasites, which are transmitted mostly by the Aedes aegypti mosquito as well as female Anopheles. And there are 4 main types of malaria: P. falciparum, P. vivax, and several others. All you need to know is that almost all cases are caused by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Quite frankly, the fact that only 10 species of mosquito are capable of transmitting malaria in the first place is a very interesting factoid, and it suggests that the solution to malaria is to genetically modify mosquitoes so that they cannot breed. So the symptoms usually show up about 10 to 15 days after a mosquito bite, and the most common ones are fever, chills, headache, nausea, and muscle pain. But if untreated, it usually causes anemia, respiratory problems, and it eventually kills, at least semi-frequently, in developing countries. Although, in all fairness, part of the problem is bad nutrition. And bad nutrition means that children in developing countries are the ones who are most likely to die of malaria, which is incredibly tragic. So it starts with a mosquito bite, and then it spreads from there. And it wasn't until 1897 that Sir Ronald Ross, a British doctor in India, discovered that mosquitoes were responsible for spreading malaria. And his research was vital to help understand how the disease spread, which led to better prevention methods. Even today, malaria is a global health issue, and in 2022, there were an estimated 249 million cases and around 608,000 deaths worldwide, mainly affecting Africa, South Asia, where India is one of the hardest hit regions. Prevention efforts usually focus on using insecticide-treated mosquito nets, spraying insecticides indoors, and using anti-malaria drugs. The most effective treatments today are artemisinin-based combination therapies, or ACT. Malaria and colonialism in India. When the British ruled India, they made big changes to the landscape, which unintentionally made malaria worse. which is a pretty obvious statement. It turns out that converting an economy to plantation-based agriculture creates a lot of spaces for malaria swamps and malaria infection. Large-scale deforestation, mass irrigation projects, and railway construction, created standing water, which then allowed the mosquitoes to breed. The British also moved large numbers of workers across the country, which exposed non-immune populations to malaria regions, which created outbreaks. British officials were first concerned with protecting their own soldiers and administrators from malaria. They drained the swamps, built better housing, and encouraged the use of quinine, a medicine derived from the chinchoa tree bark. However, these measures were rarely extended to the Indian population, who continued to suffer from the disease at high rates, quite frankly because of racism. Indigenous perspectives and responses. Before colonial rule, Indian communities had their own explanations and treatments for malaria. A Ayurvedic medicine describes fever-related illnesses and used plant-based remedies like neem and other herbs to reduce symptoms. Some communities associated the disease with environmental or spiritual causes, and these treatments affected their beliefs. When the British introduced Western medicine, they often dismissed local knowledge. Over time, however, some Indian communities combined traditional remedies with Western treatment, including the use of quinine. Despite this, many colonial health efforts failed to take cultural perspectives into account, leading to mistrust and resistance to British medical interventions. In all fairness, the British and other colonial powers instituted new institutions and new ways of living and similar things, often against the wishes of the local population. So it is not unreasonable to say that the reason why everyone distrusted British doctors and British medicine is because if every other institution is repressive, why would you trust foreigners who are attempting to impose their own new medical ways of doing things on the population as well? This also probably didn't help that British military power and public health power were heavily connected, which most colonial powers did this. For example, you can just look up the history of public health, and I have some pretty good books on that I could recommend in the future. But oftentimes, police would be sent in to help public health officials forcibly vaccinate people, and if that can occur in the homeland proper, like in the U.S. proper, I wouldn't be surprised about what kind of horrors were put on the Indian population. Is malaria really a tropical disease? It's often called a tropical disease because it's most common in tropical and subtropical areas. However, the label is pretty misleading. Historically, malaria existed in plenty of other areas, including parts of Europe and North America, until public health measures eliminated it. Considering malaria a tropical disease also carries a colonial legacy. It makes it seem like the disease is an inevitable part of certain regions rather than a problem influenced by historical, economic, and political factors. The reality is that colonialism, environmental changes, and global inequalities have played major roles in where malaria thrives today. By looking at malaria's history in colonial India, we can see how deeply health is connected to politics and economics. It also reminds us that effective disease control must consider local knowledge and community needs, not just top-down solutions. Thank you for listening to Tropical Chronicles. I hope this discussion helps shed light on the history of malaria and why understanding its past is important for tackling it today. And quite frankly, none of these issues really went away. The U.S. used to have malaria basically everywhere in the South. and even the Sacramento Delta area. But malaria in the South was eradicated in the 1950s. There used to be malaria in Italy, but that was kind of eradicated. There was malaria along the Thames River in London up until the 1950s, which is honestly shockingly recent. And often Western donors, when they focus on public health, often come in with a perspective in which they seek to impose their method of doing things on a local population, regardless of the local population's will. So all of these factors have created a deep distrust of Western institutions and can heavily undermine public health efforts in developing countries. Additionally, for example, in Ireland, there was a huge outbreak of TB during Angor Timor, or the Great Dying, also known as, the Irish potato famine. And during that time, it was believed that TB was, because they're inferior people. And quite frankly, oftentimes we see at best patronizing attitudes, and at worst, well, of course there's going to be disease in developing countries because, well, they're poor and miserable. But much like how that instance ignored all historical context, that continues today, and public health should change to reflect that. Thanks for watching. Bye.